Welcome back, everybody. It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. So I'm going to go over a couple more auction draft tips and tricks. I know a lot of you guys wanted some more of these, and I did do a video over this about a month ago or so. So if you guys haven't watched that one, I do highly recommend going to take a look at that one. There were a lot more tips in that one. That one had about 10 or so. I'll just be covering 5 more additional ones for you guys in this one, but I highly recommend using all of them. I personally do a lot of auction drafts every single year. The 3 leagues, I guess 4 leagues that I'm the most invested in generally every year, those are all auction drafts. It's a lot of fun for me. I find that they're really my favorite type of draft. I do highly recommend that you guys do give them a try as well if you haven't before. If you guys are in a league that has historically done stake drafts, just propose an auction draft as an alternative. I promise you guys, once you do it, you absolutely will not go back. It is by far the best auction or the best draft platform and way of going about it. So I love it. Hopefully you guys are finding these tips and tricks useful as well. I think I've got a decent amount of experience doing this. I've been drafting and auction drafts for like 6 years now, so got a pretty good feel of how it goes down. Obviously, things are never going to go the way you expect them to go into your draft, but having all these tips and tricks in your back pockets can help you be really prepared and be really able to dominate your draft and really adapt as things break down, where a lot of the managers in your league might not perform as well when things go south. So yeah, I hope you guys are finding this useful. If you guys have any other tips and tricks, let me know in the comments as well. Love hearing what you guys have to say as well. We can all work together to try and have some better drafts this season. So yeah, with that, let's just get to it. So start things off with my first tip. It's going to be just to not get emotional about things. It happens in almost every auction draft I'm in where there will at least be one opportunity, maybe 2 or 3, where a couple managers just get into a bidding war over a player, and that player just goes for far more than they're worth. There will be someone who just missed out on a player that they really want, and they'll force their way into getting a player. You'll have 2 guys just sort of going back and forth over a guy they were emotionally attached to prior to the draft. And what ends up happening is you have these guys that are supposed to go for $10, $15, and it happens every draft where one of those guys will end up going for $30 just because these guys are 2 managers going back and forth, sort of having a bit of a pissing contest and just sort of letting their pride get in the way. They don't want to let the other manager sort of outbid them, outdo them. It feels bad to lose in a bidding war like that, but you have to understand that you're not losing when you do that. You're saving yourself a lot of money. You're not putting yourself in a spot where you're overpaying for a player just because you're trying to prove a point. And I find that a lot of managers put themselves in bad situations doing that. It's sort of the same, not necessarily the same thing, but I also would in general just don't ever place a bid that you're not going to be happy you win. So it's a pretty common strategy in auction drafts as well, where people are going to want to no, sort of bid up players, bid up their opponents, and just place bids on players they're not necessarily going to be excited about winning. And I find that's just sort of a bit of a recipe for disaster. If you try doing it, more often than not, you're going to get stuck with the player that you were trying to bid up, and you'll end up just paying for a player that you didn't necessarily want. And I know it sucks to see guys that you weren't necessarily invested in going for really cheap, because you would have obviously hoped that they go for expensive, make your opponents a lot less rich going into the later parts of the draft. But it's just better to make sure that you save your money and get the guys that you want. And if you're going to place a bid, make sure that you're going to be happy that if you do win that bid. Don't put yourself in a spot where you're surprised you got a guy and the whole rest of the draft you're sad that you spent $40 on a guy that you just didn't have any intention of drafting. So next tip here is going to be just to constantly budget for your roster here. I personally keep a running spreadsheet during my draft outlining sort of what my roster looks like. I sort of put in different little dollar figures going over how much I anticipate spending on each position on my roster. And then as I actually draft a player to fill that position, I make an effort to go into that spreadsheet and actually modify how much I spent on those positions. And then I can sort of adjust and see, okay, maybe I meant to spend $30 in this position, but I actually got them for $25. Now I know I've got $5 extra to spend somewhere else, then I can make sure that as I save money or as I spend more money on a position, I can really just make sure that I'm making decisions prior to actually having these guys be nominated, and that way I'm making sure that I'm constantly allocating my budget properly. If you do this right, you're almost always going to find that you're going to spend effectively your entire budget. I had my first big auction draft today. I spent all 200 of my dollars. Didn't feel like I was in a bad spot at any point. Really felt like I was in control of my budget. And if you just do this, you're not going to find yourself in a position where you're looking back on the draft and you're spending $30 on your defense just to make sure that you feel better about it. It's just a lot better to make sure that you're making sure you're spending every single dollar wisely. You don't want to put yourself in a spot where you don't allocate that budget properly, because if you don't do that, I mean, if you miss out on $30 like I just referenced there, that's like standard like 3rd round pick kind of player. Can you imagine going in to your start of the season in a snake draft just effectively foregoing a 3rd round draft pick? It's not like it kills you at all, but it's certainly a huge red flag. Definitely makes it more difficult, makes it an uphill battle going forward the rest of the season. So if you can make sure that you are allocating your budget properly throughout the entire course of the draft, making sure that as you save money, you're rolling that over into upgrades at other positions. As you spend more money than you anticipated, making sure you're being cognizant and intentional about where you're sort of cutting back on your roster, it's really going to help make sure that you are adequately prepared to spend every single dollar you go into your draft with, and you're going to feel really good about how your draft turns out if you do that right. My next tip is going to be to be willing to draft any player. I know a lot of people will sort of coin the phrase like that player's off my draft board, or there's no way I'm touching him with a 10-foot pole. And I get it. There are a lot of players that I'm by no means excited about and guys that I don't really intend to draft in most of my drafts. But in very many drafts, there are drafts where every single person in the draft room has that same feeling about a player. And what ends up happening is that player just goes for extremely cheap because nobody wants to be the guy that ends up drafting him. And a lot of times these guys end up being some of the biggest bargains in the draft. I tell a story about a couple years ago where Josh Jacobs had his career year. He was supposed to be like a $20, $30 asset, and I got him in an auction draft for $4 because nobody wanted him. That guy ended up winning me the league that season. So that does certainly happen, and it's just important to be willing to draft players, even if you didn't necessarily have any intention of going into your draft, drafting them. In one of my biggest buy-in leagues, it happened just today before I'm recording this. Stephon Diggs went for $7 in that draft. I'm not a Diggs fan. I didn't get him either, but it's tough to argue that the manager who got him there didn't get a value, even though I personally don't expect him to necessarily return value there. He's a guy that's supposed to go for in like the $25 range, could easily end up being a huge deal if things break right, and at that price tag, he's well worth it. So even if you're not in on a guy like that, be willing to draft him if things present themselves that well. It's just often, it's a good trap. It's not a trap that people fall into. It's just they will not take a player regardless of the value that shows up, and it's a big sort of setback when you get into drafts where a lot of managers are sharp and you see players that pretty much everybody's out on, so they go for way too cheap. I personally find that it's a good idea to go into your draft to sort of have a rough idea of how much you're willing to spend on effectively every single player. If you want to make a running spreadsheet, just put a dollar value of how much you'd be willing to spend on each player. Even if it's super low, if you're only willing to spend $3 on Stephon Diggs, that's fine. But it's good to just sort of put those dollar values next to you and just know that in case they're in a situation where nobody else in your league is willing to pay more than you, just be willing to take those values on guys that you're not necessarily excited about, because there is a chance you're wrong. And if you are wrong and you get these guys for super cheap, it could easily be a situation where you honestly win your league just because you were willing to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong about a player. So the next tip here is just going to be to have a bunch of backup plans available to yourself. I personally like to go into a draft with a spreadsheet full of a bunch of potential rosters. I like to play around with how I can go about things, just sort of looking at the pre-draft values and seeing what kind of teams I can build based off of which kind of players fall to me. So I'll go, for example, build a roster. What happens if I take Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts early? What happens if I take Sam Laporta or Travis Kelce early? What happens if I spend up on 2 high-end running backs or 2 high-end receivers? And just sort of build out a bunch of different rosters to see what kind of teams build up. I then sort of like to rank them in terms of just which builds I like the most. And then what I like to do is, as the draft goes along, as I get a player, so say I built a team that had 2 top-tier wide receivers. If I get a top-tier wide receiver, I will make sure to fill that into the spreadsheet. But if I don't, maybe the top tier wide receiver was my favorite plan. If a really great bargain shows up at a high-end running back and I end up taking them, I at least have rosters built and I can see how I would have liked to build out my roster, and then I can go in and put in those potential savings that I got on that value and really see how I can really build my roster that way. That way you're never going into a position where you're building into you're making a roster build that you weren't necessarily prepared for. That way you always have a sort of template to follow. It's going to make it really easy for you to fill out your roster and be optimized at how you're spending your money, and that way you'll know whether or not you're going to be happy with that plan either. So it's really helpful to have that. Make sure that you always have something in mind. Even if you do something that wasn't necessarily expected, you'll have some sort of template to go by. Make sure you fill out your roster properly. And the last tip I'll give you guys in this video is going to be just to get your guys. And this isn't me telling you guys that you should pay double for a player just because you like him more than the next guy. What I'm telling you here is that it happens all too often, especially to me, even in drafts where you're on the fence. It's the middle of the draft. You're in that fourth, fifth round range, especially is where this happens to me for a guy. And you're targeting one of these special guys that you have sort of marked on your board. He's someone that you really do want to get, and he gets just like $1 or 2 more expensive than you wanted to pay. And it often is a very easy decision to make there just to be out on that guy. And I find that it's almost always better just to make the bid, get the guy, overpay a little bit, and you're just going to feel a lot better about your roster if you do that. What happens if you don't do that is you still need that position to be filled because you were obviously waiting on it. So for example, say you were a big fan of, we'll just say Cooper Kupp this year. You were looking to spend $20 on him. You got up to 25, so you didn't feel like you could do it, so you backed off. And now Zay Flowers is the next guy on the board. You still really need a receiver because you were pretty much banking on getting that kind of player. You're banking on getting like that guy as your wide receiver 2 or 3. And at that point, you're going to feel like you need to go out and still get a player to fill that void. And what ends up happening is you end up spending almost as much on that player that you got instead as you would have if you just wanted to get the guy that you wanted, and you're just way less excited about that player. So my general advice is that if you're on the fence about a guy that you were really stoked about getting, if it gets a little bit out of hand, $1 or $2, a couple dollars here and there, just get the guy. It's not going to really sink your draft just because you spend a couple more dollars on a player, and you're going to feel a lot better about your roster because you got someone you were excited about instead of sort of settling and spending the same amount on a guy that you just didn't like. So that'll do it for the auction draft tips and tricks videos this year. If you guys have any other tips and tricks or any other questions you want to ask in the comments, feel free to let me know there. It's always a lot of fun to interact with you guys there, and I'm happy to give you guys any additional tips you want in the comments for sure. Up next, I'll go over some tips and tricks I have for snake drafts as well. I think I'll also provide you guys with some recaps on some of my drafts this week, give you guys just a peek behind the curtain in terms of what teams I'm personally drafting. That way you guys can see in reality what I'm really coming up with in terms of my roster is the teams that I'm putting a lot of money behind and teams that I'm personally invested in. So that way you know that you can sort of look to build that kind of roster as well if that's something you're interested in. So hopefully you guys are liking that. If you guys are new to the channel, there's going to continue to be 4+ videos the entire rest of the season every single week. So if you guys want to make sure you get access to all of that, just make sure you subscribe to the channel that way you don't miss anything. I will be here all year long to help you guys win your championships. On top of that, if you've made it this far in the video, please do give the video a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm and just really helps you know that I'm doing a good job and all that. So yeah, I really appreciate you guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're 2 weeks from real football here, less than that, and it's going to be a really fun season. So excited for this. Appreciate all you guys, and I'm going to catch you with the next one. Peace. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter @RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.